Welcome back to Spend. I'm your host, Preet Banerjee, and every week we dive into some of the largest panel data from North America to see how people are really spending their money. And joining me, as he does every week, is Derrick Fung. Derrick, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Preet. Thanks for having me.
So this week, I wanted to dig into income and the change in income that is actually being seen, because the job loss numbers over the last couple of months have been absolutely mind-boggling. What's your overall take? Were you as surprised as I was about how big those initial jobless numbers were?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, economists compare this recession to, the Great Depression, and I think on my end, what surprised me and a lot of folks that have been watching these numbers is the most recent number in which the U.S. actually added jobs. And everyone was expecting the U.S. to, hit some of the largest unemployment numbers of recent times. So clearly the economy seems to be bouncing back again, but we definitely started doing a bit of a deeper dive to see what was really happening, and that's what we're going to talk about today.
All right, so let's get right into it. Our first chart here is taking a look at the overall income distribution pre-COVID versus basically right now. So walk us through the big changes.
Yeah, I'd say the biggest changes, when you look at this this pie chart, you'll see that, there's a new group that was created, which are individuals that no longer have income, and you'll see that, it's a lot of shifting around. So I'd say that's probably the biggest, thing to point out. It's that, it's everyone is getting impacted, and, a lot of shifting pre and post COVID in terms of income levels.
Yeah, and I think what I'll point out here for people who are wondering, so there's a new category on the right-hand chart which says no income. So obviously there were people who had no income before COVID, but when we take a look at the people in this sample, in this panel data, before there was no one in this group that had no income, but so many people have now fallen into that category. But if you take a look at the other categories as well, these different brackets, basically the whole income distribution has sort of shifted lower.
Yes.
So let's take a look a little bit deeper and take a look at the change in income by income bracket. And we're taking a look here at the percentage of people who had no change versus a decline in income versus those with a full income loss. So walk us through this.
Yeah, I'd say the biggest takeaway here is when you hear about a lot of these job loss numbers, it doesn't give you the full picture. And when you look at the changes in income across all the different brackets, you'll actually see that the highest bracket, actually saw the most significant decline in terms of income at 49.2% on the lower end, and what is that, 83% on the high end. So again, when you look at some of these publicly followed and tracked numbers, it doesn't give you the full picture, because there are a lot of people on the higher end of income actually seeing declines in terms of salary cuts, and when you add them all up, it's actually quite significant.
Yeah, and so there were two things that kind of stood out to me on this particular chart, and as you said, the percentage of people seeing a decline was concentrated more on people with more income. But if you're in the more vulnerable categories and you're already low income, the likelihood that you would experience outright job loss was higher. So that top part of each of these bars in the dark blue is the full income loss. And you can see the lower your income was, the more likely you were to have full income loss. But again, like you said, if you go up higher on the income spectrum, the number of people that saw declines was big as well. So it's kind of hitting people across the board. And this chart, I think, breaks that down a little bit more clearly. This is looking at income loss by these different brackets. So what's your take here?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about some of those high brackets, they're companies that I think it's one of those, we're in one of those global events that clearly, again, as I mentioned, it's affecting everyone. But when you look at this chart, it's large companies that may have had to make certain cuts with their executives, or certain higher paid individuals, whether it's software engineers, or out west, or Wall Streeters who are all taking cuts. And I think it's again one of those recessions that's affecting all companies across the spectrum. And I think this is what we're seeing here when you look at some of the income cuts of the higher end tax income bracket.
Yeah, and another thing I'll point out on this chart is if you look at the people in the under 25,000 range, it looks like the average income loss isn't that big, but this is not a conditional average. This is all people in that bracket. So that also includes people who are making a little bit more because of either pandemic surpluses, if they're in a more of a frontline job. We hear about some grocery chains that are paying extra $2 per hour, what have you. So it doesn't accurately, I think, reflect for the people who have experienced losses. That number is probably a lot bigger. And so that number, again, looks a little bit lower than it could be, because certainly people on the lower end of the income spectrum, we've heard a lot of stories about how hard they're getting hit. But also, let's take a look at age and what impact has there been based on how old workers are.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at the data, definitely it's skewed. Younger individuals are getting hit harder in terms of impact to income. So if you look at this graph, 18 to 25, seeing a 12.8% of them seeing a greater than 50% decline in their income, which is quite a staggering number.
Yeah, that is massive. So there's that almost middle column where you've got that percent delta, which is that little triangle symbol. Delta just means change in, and you can see as you go from bottom to top, basically the numbers gets bigger in terms of that loss. And if you go to the second last column on the right, that greater than 50% decline, again, it's kind of the same thing. It looks like it's more concentrated for younger people. And the last thing that I wanted to point out was some initiatives, some messaging that is, I think, slowly starting to be heard by policymakers. And one of the champions of this has been Armine Yalnizyan, who's an Atkinson Fellow on the Future of Workers. She's a Canadian economist, but I think we're seeing the same trends sort of North American wide. And she has been pounding the table with this phrase, which I think is easy to remember, really encapsulates what's going on. She's saying, there's no recovery without a she-covery, and there's no she-covery without childcare. So basically, what a lot of economists have pointed out is that women have been disproportionately affected in this event. And that's because when you take a look at the types of industries that have been forced to shut down, and you can't have as many people just working from home, are things like hotels, travel, service, retail. And these are predominantly where you find more women working than men. So more women have been affected. And if you compare that to, say, the great financial crisis, that was more of a he session where, for example, manufacturing was more disproportionately affected. So this is more of a she session, which means that you need to sort of gear your policies towards a she covery. And you can't do that unless you think about childcare. Because again, when it comes to, as an example, let's say you have two people working and they both lost their jobs or now have to work from home, we still find that disproportionately that women are taking the brunt of the load of some of the duties at home, like child rearing and what have you. So in order to properly manage this from a policy perspective, you can't sort of go to the same old playbook and say, oh, we'll just spend more money on infrastructure projects because that will get some people back to work, but it doesn't account for this issue, which is this she session. And if you want a she covery, you need to take a look at things like childcare so that part of the population can go back to work. So anyways, there's a lot of things to break down. We've talked a little bit this episode about the impact on income. But next week, we're going to take a look at debt and credit and what have been the changes. And I'm really interested to see this, Derrick, because I kind of believe that for a little while, people can go a couple of months, without the same level of income because I think they are relying too much on debt. But as that starts to run out, as the income supports start to run out, I don't know what that means for the fall. Do you have any
Yeah.
predictions?
Yeah, I mean, we see in the data, over two-thirds of the panel have now received their stimulus check, and there's ongoing talks of the U.S. government continuing to support Americans. The question is, after the first check has been spent, how will Americans continue to spend? Will they continue to spend? Will they be tapping credit to potentially continue to spend? So I do think we're still in the early innings, and it'll be very, very interesting to continue to watch this recovery because, as you mentioned, it is a very unique one that is very different than anything we've seen in recent times. So also very curious to take a deeper dive to see what the data says.
Yeah, and so many unknowns, especially, the nature and the size of a potential second wave. When does it hit? How big is it? We really have no idea, which is why it's so important to dive into the actual data to see what is happening on the ground. So, thanks so much for joining me again this week, Derek. We'll see you next week.
See you soon. Thanks, Bree.